Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to show you how to paint this rose in a vintage, older type style, and we are using paints from my friend Kelly at Letter Sparrow, and these paints are amazing, you guys. Very high quality paints. And of course I'm using my round brush from Polina Bright. You can use any round brush, and I am using 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. So the first question you might be asking yourself is, what makes this painting in particular vintage? Well, if you look back and you do some research on vintage florals, they're very precise and detailed, and so I don't usually start with a sketch, but I did today because I want every stroke that I make to be on purpose and to be planned out. Another thing that makes paintings specifically vintage are some of the outlining that was done back 50 years ago, the light and dark variations, and the added color pops that are unexpected, and so we'll get into more of that later. But for now, I'm just really planning out this sketch. I have a open rose concept with rosebuds and lots of leaves coming off the side, making sure that everything has correct proportions and is positioned well. I'm looking at the sketch and making sure the composition looks balanced and that the rose in the center is the main focus. But I'll show you a close-up of the sketch in just a second. So with the sketch, I did the idea of veining and I didn't focus too much on the edges of the leaves. All of that stuff I can add in with paint. I just really want to make sure the positioning and the shape of everything is how I want. Another thing that makes this painting more vintage is that there is very little white space, and you know I'm a fan of that white space, negative space, but with vintage style paintings, because they outlined and did so much detail, we don't need the negative space to give us the illusion of leaf veins and petals being separated, because we're going to add those in with paint. So I'm just filling in all of the flower and not the center with a nice mix of the Mayan red and ultra rose from this color palette, and I want darker areas, I want lighter areas. Where the petals curve up and would be catching more of the sunlight, I'm keeping those areas light. Areas where the petals would be shadowed or hidden behind other petals, those areas I am adding a little bit more of the pigmented color. This first layer of color for the flower I don't want too detailed. I just really want to get down some of the base colors, and so I'm playing that game of adding color and softening the edges so nothing is too sharp yet. To soften an edge of a paint stroke that you've painted, you just rinse your brush, dab it on paper towel, and then go back over that sharp edge and kind of blend and feather it out. Now for the leaves, and I mixed together the pistachio, Verone, yellow sun, and Mayan red to get this color. You just need to play around with the mixtures till you like the color, but I love color mixing, and this palette is perfect for mixing all different shades of green, purple, pinks, yellows. It's just the best. So I just follow the sketch lines and paint in the leaves with the color green that I've mixed up. And then after I've got the initial shape down, I go through and I add the little points on the end by dragging the tip of the brush from the middle of the leaf outward. With this vintage style, you want some areas of your leaves and your stems to be lighter and some to be darker. When we go through and add that signature outline at the end, you're going to want some nice contrast with the darkness of the outline color and the stem and the leaves. So don't be afraid to keep it really light and add some areas where it's a little bit of a darker gradient. So you'll remember in the beginning of the video, I mentioned that one of the ways a painting looks vintage is from the unexpected pop of colors that it has. So in these green leaves, we are going to add just a little bit of that ultra rose and Mayan red mixture we used on the rose. And even though this might seem like a totally out there color, because red and green are complementary colors, this actually works really well, not only to mute the green and add variety and texture, but visually to the eye it looks appealing and it really has that vintagey feel. I'm also going to speed through some of the painting, especially for the leaves, because the process is rather repetitive, but it's the same technique for every leaf. Fill in the basic shape with the green, add the texture on the edges. You can take some of the paint away to make areas lighter, and then also adding in that rose color for that vintage feel. The rosebuds are also very similar in the creation. Just make sure that your strokes are nice and thin when you go up to the top of the leaf that surrounds the rosebud, and when you're painting those little leaves that connect the bud to the stem, just make your strokes nice and thin and light. And remember, we're not creating white space or leaving negative space behind. We're going to want to fill in the entire sketch that we have penciled in. And of course, don't forget to drop in some of the rose color onto your rosebuds as well. The pop of color that we're going to be adding to the rose is a mixture of saffron, yellow, and Mayan red. And we're just adding it in certain highlighted areas, taking a little bit away. We really just want the idea of the color because it adds such an interesting texture and depth to the entire rose. Now I'm taking a very concentrated pigment of the Mayan Red Ultra Rose mixture that we originally painted on our rose, and I'm going through and I am darkening the areas that are shadowed. So what this does is it will really highlight the areas on the tips of some of these petals that are supposed to be the little highlight as the rose petal curves upward. And so the only way that we can accentuate those tips and we can actually see that they are lighter and catching sun is if we kind of outline other areas around it in this darker pigment. So I'm going through and pretty much outlining and spreading and feathering out the paint around the entire rose to really give those highlighted areas a lot of contrast with the darker areas. So we've been feathering a lot of these darker contrast areas, but one way to make this feel really vintage is to leave some of these areas of contrast heavy and dark. So we're going to lay some of these areas thick and leave them without feathering. I'm also adding another layer of that saffron color that we had for our surprise color in our rose. Now we are moving on to the veining in our leaves, and this is when it becomes really fun in the painting because it really takes a kind of ordinary painting and makes it that vintage feel. So one of the ways to make it feel very vintage is to make sure your lines are really thin. Sometimes it's not a full line, so your brush will skip over an area and it won't be a complete line, which is perfect. Some areas of the line will look heavier, some areas of the line will look thinner. You're going to want to really vary how each leaf looks. You don't have to do the same kind of lines. You don't have to do the same number of lines. Just really keeping things thin. Be very deliberate when things are darker, and they don't have to be complete lines. This color for this darker green that I'm using to outline the leaves and for the veining in the leaves, I took the same green that I used to paint the leaves and the stems, and I added more Mayan red, more pistachio, a little bit of the ultra rose, anything to get this really dark, deep color, but I still wanted it to lean green. I just wanted it to be a nice dark color that provides a lot of contrast for the outlining. For the actual outlining of the leaf, you're going to take the same color that you used for the veining, and you're going to only do a few areas of the outline. You don't want to completely draw a very steady and complete line around the entire leaf. You want it to be jagged. You want it to be kind of open in certain areas where you're not totally right next to the leaf. You want some areas to be really thin, some areas to be really thick. You want a line that has a lot of separations to give it that nice vintage feel. I'm painting the areas around the stem in the same way that I painted them around the leaves. The lines are not connected, some areas are thinner and some areas are thicker and darker. But one of the ways you can make it look like your dark areas are on purpose is if you make stylistic choices like making sure that whenever a leaf meets the stem, it's particularly darker and looks very on purpose. And this will make all of the outlining in your whole painting look like you purposefully made strokes for that stylistic reason and they weren't just random. Now we are moving on to the center. So I'm using that same yellow saffron color and I created a oval for the center, and I'm painting these really short strokes, really thin lines for the stamen around the center. I want to maintain white space between the center oval and the stamen lines. I'm gradually building up the color in the stamens, so now I am using a darker color of the saffron and doing a few less strokes around for more of like a contrasting stroke for the stamen, and also a little bit around the center. And while that dries, I am going to outline the petals. And again, the outlining on the petals is very similar to how we outlined the leaves and the stems. You're going to want to do some areas thicker, some areas thinner, not always connecting the lines. I like to keep most of the petal lines as thin as I can and then focus on some of my darker areas in between the petals so that they can also serve as shadows. Because one of the hallmark features of a vintage floral piece is lots of detail, I'm also adding these really thin lines around the petals to give some of that veining to the petals, and we can see it adds a lot of detail, a lot of contrast, and makes it look even more vintage. For the darkness around the center, I mixed in a very dark rosy red, but also added a lot of ultra rose and green. So we have an almost black, but it leans more red. And so we're going to do some heavy dots around the edge. As we get to the edge that's closest to us, because we're looking at it from an angle, we don't want those darker dots to be touching the petals. So the dots that are farther away from us, we want to be connecting that space between the white space and the petals. But the dots towards us, we want to be a little bit off the edge of the petal because we want some of that stamen to be coming through down there so that it looks as if we are seeing some of that stamen kind of popping up in front of us. So while those little dots we've created are still wet, I'm going through with some of that darker saffron color and making more stamen lines, and I want them to kind of blend together just a little bit, kind of connects all of those pieces of the center. And you might have been watching this video and thinking, oh my gosh, she forgot the rosebuds. And you're totally right. I did forget the rosebuds. And I went to film the finished piece and I was like, hey, something's missing. So here are the rosebuds. I am using the same techniques with outlining that I did throughout the rest of the piece. She is finished and she is cute. Thank you so much for being here with me today as we painted this vintage floral piece. You can really use any of these techniques to make any floral a more vintage style. Also, make sure to check out my friend Kelly at Letter Sparrow for these beautiful paints, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.